Now we're going to have a talk about security. So Brendan and I will both do this one. With ASP.NET Core or .NET Core in general, there's 4 security choices. So there's no security, obviously. If you don't require security for your application, that would be the default choice. Then there's Windows Authentication, ASP.NET Core Identity, and Identity Server 4. And with the new ASP.NET Core 3, there's actually some templates that are using ASP.NET Core Identity with Identity Server 4.
Yeah, all baked in.
Baked in, so which is really nice. So some of those things, 3 of those things can use OAuth 2. So we're going to have a quick chat about the abstract flow associated with OAuth 2. So there's 4 main kind of responsibilities, I guess, in the OAuth 2 flow. There's the client, which is not us, that's the actual application. The resource owner, which is us. So if we were talking about, say, our Northwind Traders sample project, the client would be the Northwind Traders web UI. Whereas the resource owner would be the customer or the employee that's using the Northwind Traders site. Then there's the authorization server, which is responsible for authorizing the client. It knows about the client, it knows about the resource owner, and it can authorize on their behalf. And then there's the resource server, which is where we're storing our protected resources. So in the example of Northwind Traders, the client and the resource server are the same thing. The resource server is the back-end API with all of the protected resources, and the client's the web UI. So basic flow looks like this. The client makes an authorization request, and that gets sent to the resource owner. The resource owner may need to log in, and if they then accept that request, it responds with a authorization code. Following that, the client can use the authorization code to send that authorization to the authorization server, which will respond with an access token. So that completes the authentication process as far as the abstract flow is concerned. Now, using that access token, the client is then free to make calls to the resource server for protected resources, such as, in the case of an employee, maybe a list of orders for their sales region. So when the access token is validated, the protected resource is then returned to the client. So that's an abstract flow. There are a number of flows associated with OAuth 2, such as the implicit flow, password flow, that sort of thing. So check into those to understand it a little bit better. Consider that to be a summary. So let's have a talk through this. I'll let you take this, Brennan.
So Windows Authentication is the first one we're going to talk to. Windows Authentication has the distinction of being the easiest to implement, but only if you're hosting on Windows under IIS. So this is your classic, Windows Authentication that you use if you're on local intranet and all your users have got Active Directory accounts on the local system. They can all log into those local resources via Windows Authentication. You can publish to the internet, but you need some sort of clever proxy server things to do it. There's a system called F5 that I've seen a client use, where they have their intranet applications. They're there mainly for internal use, but if they can then host them on the outside, put a login screen in front of it, people log in with their Windows credentials, it then F5 sorts out the authentication and proxies that connection outside. There are issues with using this though. System.directory services, for example, isn't there by default in .NET Core. There's a Windows compatibility pack. Another thing to consider is ADFS, Active Directory Federation Services, can support OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect. Those are the 2 protocols that give you more kind of single sign-on type systems. But we'll cover those in more detail when we go into more identity server type setups. If we click forward, If we want to use Windows Authentication, you start up by just going to your services section in startup, just for everything else, and just turn on this option .forward Windows Authentication. So that tells Kestrel, or tells .asp.net under Kestrel, to start reading whatever headers IIS sends you to tell you that you're authenticated. Then you look at a web.config file. So we told you can host this underneath IIS. To host ASP.NET Core under IIS, you install this ASP.NET Core plugin, which then gives you this ASP.NET Core section to put in system.web server. And inside there, you give it settings like where to find ASPNET Core, and also one option there is for Windows Auth token. So you set up IIS with a site that's got Windows Authentication turned on, put that in the web.config file, and then that will forward Windows Authentication stuff through to your running Kestrel process. That's pretty much it for Windows Authentication. Okay, ASP.NET Core Identity. This is the bit inside ASP.NET Core to handle logins and authentication. So this is the engine that gives you that ability to decorate your controllers with authorized, or decorate your endpoints with authorized controllers. You've also got some providers there. You've got a membership provider built in. So this membership provider is good for those scenarios where you've got a single database and a single web server, and you want people to register on your site. So you want them to register on your site, you want the passwords they enter to get saved to the database somewhere, and you want a system to manage that. So if you turn on the membership provider here, it will manage creating those right records. It can save that detail to SQL Server via Entity Framework Core. It will properly encrypt your passwords, and you've got options for two-factor authentication. It doesn't out of the box give you two-factor authentication. What it gives you are a bunch of interfaces you can use to wire in your email sender or wire in your SMS sender. So it does all the work to generate tokens and that kind of stuff, but you need to actually do the bit of code that sends that two-factor authentication out. You also have baked into here support for external providers. So by external providers, I mean use your Facebook login, or use your Google login, or use your Twitter login. The mechanism for all that is OAuth and OIDC. So in this particular setup, ASP.NET Core Identity acts as an OIDC client. It's not the full OIDC server. Those third-party authenticators, for example, if you're using Google login, you will land on the site, say use your Google, it will probably jump you out to Google to log in, then come back here when you're logged in by your Google login. So those are all systems you can use with ASP.NET Core Identity. And to use ASP.NET Core Identity, once again, like everything else, you set it up in startup.cs. So you've got a services.addIdentity to push the identity stuff in there. Then app.useIdentity wires in the endpoints to kind of handle the endpoint routing stuff. And then from there, you've also got a bunch of things you can configure. So if you're using the membership provider, you can configure password complexity rules, you can configure logout settings, or lockout settings, I should say. So for example, if you don't want people spamming you with password attempts, so what you can do is lock someone out after 10 failed attempts and they're locked out for 30 minutes. Just enough to protect from brute force attacks. You can also set up cookies. So in this particular scenario, we're actually using your classic session cookies to look after your login. So there's cookies there, those cookies get set up, and that's all available. So that's your kind of old school, single server, sign on, log in with the username and password. That username and password with the password encrypted gets saved to a local database, or database that's close to the web server.
You see the configuration there is quite verbose, but we just show this as an example. It does have actually conventions that it applies, and it follows the best practices. So you don't need to go and specify all this, but you can.
Yeah, this is the stuff that's default, like you say, yeah. So moving on to Identity Server 4. So where ASP.NET Core Identity is a kind of type of OIDC client, and can you work with other single sign-on providers like, say, Google or your Facebook providers, Identity Server 4 is an OpenID Connect and OAuth 2 server in its own right. There's a number of ways of setting that up. So until recently, you had to install a separate Identity Server and then deploy your web application and then configure them to talk to each other. But in .NET 3, what's come out is the ability to actually just wrap up Identity Server and deploy it in your web server as one thing. So the single service will handle all the OAuth, OIDC stuff and your normal Identity Server stuff.
So it's kind of identity server in memory, isn't it?
So the question was, does that defeat the point because you want to use Identity Server with other applications? Well, it still works as an Identity Server, say for example, with a JavaScript OIDC client. So that Identity Server wrapped up in there, you're still using OIDC from the JavaScript client rather than using session cookies, for example. So that's a slightly more secure way of doing it. And you could potentially have that one endpoint server, that Identity Server, then also be the authentication point for multiple other APIs. But I think personally, if I was going to deploy an app where I had kind of one gateway, multiple APIs, and identity server, I'd put identity server separately. But there are plenty of apps where actually you just want one server to support that app. So if you want one server and still want to do identity server because of the better OID support from the clients and from the JavaScripts, then identity server 4 wrapped up in your application is actually a good story. It breaks down a lot of that complexity, and we'll show you a template later that comes with that wrapped in. In fact, if you can do .NET new, and it's now included. So the next thing I'm going to do is talk through the workflow. How does identity server work when you actually got a JavaScript single page application and a web API and identity server? What's the actual process they go through to perform your login? So I've got a few points set up here. I have got an ASP.NET Core Web API. That's the thing we've made in .NET Core. We've got identity server. In this particular example, identity server is separate, but the wrapped into the ASP.NET Core is pretty much the same. It's just the requests go to the same server. I've then got a JavaScript single page app. Could be Angular, could be React. And I've downloaded it from somewhere. That could be from the same server. It could be on a CDN somewhere. Those details are not important. But at some point, that JavaScript single page app has been downloaded and installed on the browser. So now what I want to do from that JavaScript single page app is log in. Well, the very first thing that happens is you've got this client-side code, oidcclient.js. You can download that, install it into your JavaScript programs. That gives you the client-side code to talk to OIDC servers. And we realize we're not logged in, so we need to log in. And there's some configuration that says where that is. So what happens now is you get redirected off, possibly away from your website, to a login page that's actually on identity server. And this is the pattern you see most places. You log into Google, you might go to maps.google.com, but you don't do your login on maps.google.com. It redirects you off somewhere else to do your login system, and then you get redirected back. And that's pretty much how all these things work. Once again, if you'd put identity server on the same server or in the same web app as web API, it would stay on the same URL. Otherwise, it would navigate off to where your identity server is. So at this point, your single page app has at least two pages because you've had to navigate away to this login form to perform the login. But you go to a form somewhere, you put in your username and password, hit submit, identity server checks your password, goes, yep, that's who you are, you're all right. And it then sends a redirect back to a page on your site. And when it sends that redirect back, what it includes in that redirect is an auth token. So you need at least one extra page on your site somewhere to catch that redirect and store that auth token inside local storage on the browser. Now that auth token is what you then need to keep in order to use for all subsequent requests. And that authorization token is specific for you, and it's time locked as well. So quite often there's a mechanism to refresh. You might get an auth token and a refresh token. You get an auth token that's good for 10 minutes, maybe 20 minutes, and a refresh token that's good for slightly longer, so that when the auth token is about to expire, you use the refresh token to request a new auth token that keeps you logged in for as long as you need to be. But with that auth token saved to your local storage on your browser, you now start making HTTP requests from your browser to your web API. And in this case, we'd have this wired into, in the example Jason showed you earlier with generated TypeScript client, we'd actually put interceptor code into that generated TypeScript client to push an auth token into every single request we send out. So that's the HTTP header that has the bearer authorization is the name of the header, then the value of that is bearer, and then a long string of characters, which is the token.
That's the way I've done it before. Yeah. But it depends on the front end framework that you're using. So I think now with Angular we're using interceptors, and so that's a little bit lower level. So it's basically at any HTTP request we can attach that access token or the auth token to the request. So everything goes through kind of with those credentials. That's
right. So now we provide the auth token. The ASP.NET Core Web API can then verify the auth token against identity server. I'm not quite sure if that's every request. I think it caches some of those results. But now, using that auth token, we are now logged in to that one web API or 20 web APIs, so how many web APIs we want and need to deliver our microservices. So as opposed to the sort of classic cookie-based logins, we've got a single sign-on that can scale out to as many services we've got configured up to work with that identity server setup.
And so just to be clear, it all works through that auth token, right?
Yeah,
so
that's it.
Whatever services we need access to, the protected resources, we
Yep.
pass that access token. It authenticates back with identity server and returns the protected resources.
That's right. And then to use that, I've got some stuff hidden in here. But once again, everything happens via configure services or through the app. So we've got app.user identity server authentication. That wires a few things up. And that's it.
Okay, so we're going to have just a brief look at the new template. I'm not sure. I probably won't scaffold a new one. What we might do is just grab the documentation really quickly.
Yep.
If we go to ASP.NET Core, Angular identity, put a 3 in front of that, just to be safe. That should find it for us. So this is ASP.NET Core version 3, and you can see right off the bat here we have identity with SPA, and basically it's saying the new single page app templates support API authorization, and it uses ASP.NET Core identity for authenticating and storing users. So that's for kind of the local users and references to the other users who might have come in through a separate identity provider such as Microsoft, LinkedIn, GitHub, that sort of thing. And it combines with Identity Server for implementing OpenID Connect. So I won't create one from scratch, but you can see if you do want to create it from the command line, you've only got 2 options as far as SPA is concerned. You can create one with Angular or one with React. The React plus Redux template doesn't currently support this option, so that's something you could potentially retrofit. If that's the way that you wanted to go. So from the command line, we can do it that way. File new project in Visual Studio, it's the same old dialogue, where it has the radio buttons, it's set to no authentication, and then you can choose different options. I'll show that quickly just so that we've covered the 2 approaches well. So if we go create a new project, we go ASP.NET Core Web, try that again, ASP.NET. Web application, we go next, we go create, it'll bring up the options dialog. Here we go, we say we want to create an Angular one, and then here we have no authentication currently set. Zooming in a bit, there we go. We can change that, and we can say individual user accounts, and we can store users' accounts in-app. So that's it. There's also these other options here, but not for SPA, okay? So they'll be for your MVC, your Razor pages and others. So if we have a look at that, go change for a web app, you can see we've got lots more options. So there's that. Connect to an existing store in the cloud. So if you're using Azure AD B2C, work or school accounts, and Windows authentication. So if you're trying to get some of this stuff up and running, often it's quite quick to actually look at these templates that are available. But having the authentication options now as part of the single page application templates is new, and it does a really great job. Let's have a look at the clean architecture template just to see some of this side of things. So I'll load this up in Visual Studio. So the front end of this project is a ASP.NET Core 3 single page application with Angular, and you can see here that where's the settings? I'll hide some of this so that we can see a little bit more. So it's configured with Identity Server, and it's using this Identity Server SPA profile, which basically sets the defaults for Identity Server when it's creating this. In startup, this is all out of the box. I have customized this quite a lot, so maybe it's not the best thing to look at. Well, let's have a look at. We'll have a look at the Angular app.
The identity stuff.
Yeah, I do. It's just that I've customized it quite a lot, so it might be confusing. So yeah, essentially, it's going to add this when you're configuring the services, it says services.addIdentityServer, adds API authorization, and here we're just specifying an application user and the DB context that's going to be associated with it. So that's for configuring the identity server services. And then, yeah, that's not too bad. Down the bottom here, past it. Here it is. We just say use authentication. So you can see that the configuration options are quite simple initially, and you can continue to expand those out based on your needs. So one of the things I had to do was actually to support some kind of testing approach, right? Because I have in this project subcutaneous tests that are hitting the API, and obviously some of those API endpoints are now need authentication because of the authorize attribute. And so I had to reconfigure identity server based on whether or not we were writing tests or not. So you can see here, if the environment is the test environment, that means I'm running tests. I have a completely different configuration for identity server. So I'm adding API authorization as before. I'm specifying my user entity, my application DB context, but then I'm adding a new client. I'm adding a client called cleanarchitecture.integration tests, which I can use to authenticate using the resource owner password flow. Okay, and I've got a secret there that is not very secret anymore, and the scopes that are allowed. So you see, when I write my subcutaneous tests or my functional tests, I can use that flow to authenticate. It's a very simple flow. And then here I'm adding a test user. So you can see here, still within the identity server configuration, I'm adding a test user called Jason at Clean Architecture with a password and an email claim. So I can do these sort of things by overriding the default configuration. So it has some really great conventions which make configuration initially simple, but you can of course go to the identity server for docs, start to expand some of that stuff out and use the full power of identity server 4. Yeah.
So my key takeaway there is previously getting ASP.NET Core and Identity Server all bootstrapped up and working and talking to each other used to be quite hard. It was not easy. Now it's .NET New Angular, pick authentication, and it will set up a pretty good default for you. So that's the main thing. You can get all these things wired up, configured, working, and then change a known good configuration rather than try and build the whole thing from scratch. And that's a real big improvement.
I'll start this in the background so that we can actually have a look at the experience. So we're just running the front end there, and I'll run this one from the command prompt too. Hopefully it runs. This is something that I'm currently working on and constantly committing changes to, so it shouldn't be a problem. But I also want to explore the client app just a little bit so you can see how it fits together. You can see here in the client app, in the Angular client app, they've got this API authorization folder, which is actually an Angular module, and it contains everything related to the authentication and authorization, and it comes with this template. So one of the great things is the interceptor. So remember we talked about the access token and actually attaching that to all requests. We use an interceptor to do that, and essentially any HTTP request that's going out, it's going to get the access token and it's going to add it to the header authorization and prefixing it with bearer. So we don't have to do anything else. The generated client, it's going to have that attached. So if the request does require authorization, we'll have the token there ready to go, which is nice, out of the box. So one of the things that it looked at there was a service that this is also, all of this is generated, and this service was able to expose endpoints like, sorry, not endpoints, but methods to check if you're authenticated, to get the current user, to get the access token and that sort of thing. There's also some route guards. So if the user's not authorized, we can protect that route from actually being accessed. So you can see here, this route guard just checks authorized.isAuthenticated, which is nice. Let's see, it's got some simple components for logging in. Sorry, that's just a login message. Just basically says whether you're logged in or not. There's a login menu, which basically, depending on whether you're logged in or not, it will either show hello username and a logout button, or register and login. And there's the logout, which is, I believe, just a message. Yeah, it's just a message. It says you're logged out successfully. So simple, but definitely a great starting point. And especially this stuff here, really, really great quality stuff. I mean, it was written by the experts.
Just to point out, that's all a bunch of TypeScript stuff written for you that comes in .NET New Angular. So you've got the whole client side for good authentication wired up in that template.
Yeah.
Nothing to write, just ready to go.
Yeah, that's it. So that should be started. No, it didn't start. That's okay. I won't run it. Basically,
I think we've made the points for him, right?
Yeah, we would see a login and log out and that sort of thing with the ability to edit user profiles and stuff. But I do want to make one point on that. All of those screens for the login, log out, editing user profiles, we get that for free. But when we're building single page applications, it's free, but at a cost, because the UI we get is Razor Pages UI. And so we're actually going from Spa to Razor Pages back to Spa a lot of the time. And so you end up having to create two layouts, one for the Razor Pages UI, one for your single page application. So it ends up being a bit of work to do that. So kind of one of the first things that I'll do for this project is to start creating all of those views into Angular or React or Vue, whatever it is that I'm happening to create. And the best way to start doing that is to actually scaffold. Let me see if I can find that for you. Scaffolded item. So I went right click, add new scaffolded item, and then we go to identity, and then there's only one option, identity. We click add. This will take a second, but hopefully not too long. And what we can do is we can scaffold out all of those Razor pages and look at the code behind and the UI that it's generated and just start to migrate that across to whatever it is that we're building. This is great, of course, if we're building like an ASP.NET Core web application where it is using Razor pages, then we don't have to do anything. And when we go to Blazor, when Blazor replaces everything that you're going to see next, we won't have to worry about it. But while we're still in the single page application way of doing things, we'll probably want to scaffold out some of this, maybe not all of it. Maybe you might just say, I'm going to do reset password, log in and log out, because that way I can provide a really nice user experience from my single page app point of view, and I might not do everything, because you can see there's quite a lot that it does for you that you get for free. So yeah, I think that's pretty much everything that I wanted to show for that. So definitely check out the new templates. Definitely will save you a lot of time. Yeah.
So my key points really are just learn the things that are there. There are a few options, but actually they're not separate options. They're kind of building on top of each other. I guess the only thing that's a separate option is Windows authentication, but it's not really much of an option apart from very small use cases. Identity is the ASP.NET Core identity, is the stuff built into .NET Core for handling all identity. Then optionally, you can add either the membership provider or the identity server on top. I think that's it. And the best thing is the new templates do a lot of work for you. So you can just go new template, get a working example, and if you want to change something from there. Don't try and build the whole thing from scratch because it gets complicated.